The moment a crowd decides someone is guilty without proof is the moment justice begins to disappear. Before anyone inside the Hawthorne estate realized they were about to witness a lesson they would never forget, Naomi Brooks was already being dragged across the polished marble courtyard by whispers far heavier than hands. She never resisted. She never shouted. She simply walked with quiet dignity, her Black Maid uniform perfectly pressed despite the trembling in her fingers, her dark brown eyes fixed on the ground as dozens of wealthy guests gathered beneath crystal chandeliers spilling warm light through the open ballroom doors. The afternoon celebration had been planned with impossible precision. Imported white roses lined the stone pathways. Classical music floated through hidden speakers. Expensive perfume mixed with the scent of fresh flowers and polished oak. Everything looked flawless except the frightened woman standing alone in the middle of it all. Someone claimed a diamond watch worth more than most families earned in several years had disappeared. Within minutes, rumors became certainty. Certainty became accusation. Accusation became humiliation. No one asked Naomi what had happened. No one wondered why the woman known for arriving before sunrise every morning and leaving long after midnight would suddenly risk everything for something that was never hers. The guests had already decided the ending before hearing the beginning. One woman folded her arms and muttered that people always revealed who they truly were when temptation appeared. Another shook his head with a disappointed smile that carried more cruelty than anger. Several phones quietly appeared, though no one openly admitted recording the scene. Even members of the household staff avoided looking at Naomi directly, afraid that compassion might place them beside her. She stood with perfect posture despite the weight pressing against her chest. Her makeup remained understated and elegant, but nothing could hide the sadness gathering behind her calm expression. She wanted to explain. She wanted someone to believe her. Instead, silence wrapped around her like another uniform she had never chosen to wear. Near the grand staircase, the estate manager stepped forward holding a small velvet jewelry box that had been discovered inside Naomi's locker only minutes earlier. Gasps rippled through the crowd. To many, the case alone looked like proof. Nobody questioned how it had appeared there. Nobody considered who actually had access to the staff quarters. The verdict had already been written inside their minds. Naomi slowly lifted her eyes toward the faces surrounding her, searching for one person willing to hesitate before condemning another human being. She found none. The estate gates remained closed. The luxury cars parked outside reflected the afternoon sun like polished mirrors. Somewhere beyond those gates, a low engine quietly approached, unnoticed beneath the orchestra still playing inside the mansion. And while every eye remained fixed on the woman they believed deserved punishment, not a single person realized that someone else had already begun watching them instead. The accusations spread through the estate faster than the afternoon breeze drifting across the gardens because certainty always travels more quickly than truth. Within only a few minutes, every version of the story sounded slightly different, yet every version ended with Naomi Brooks being guilty. Some claimed they had seen her acting nervous that morning. Others insisted she had looked toward the private family wing too many times. One guest confidently described details that had never happened, and with each retelling, imagination quietly replaced evidence. Naomi listened without interrupting because she knew that frightened voices rarely defeated confident lies. She had worked inside Hawthorne Estate for nearly 4 years, arriving before 6 every morning to polish the marble floors until they reflected the chandeliers like still water. She memorized every family's preferences without being asked. She knew which flowers needed fresh water before breakfast, which elderly guest preferred tea without sugar, and which children secretly left handwritten thank you notes beneath their empty dessert plates. She believed that kindness mattered even when nobody noticed it. Unfortunately, kindness almost never made headlines. Suspicion did. The velvet jewelry box resting on the polished silver tray remained at the center of everyone's attention like a trophy, proving a story that nobody wanted to question. The estate manager carefully explained that it had been discovered inside Naomi's employee locker less than 15 minutes earlier during what he described as a routine inspection. His voice sounded calm and professional, making every word feel even more convincing. Several guests nodded before he even finished speaking. They appreciated confidence more than facts. Naomi quietly searched her memory, replaying every moment since sunrise. She remembered preparing fresh linens. She remembered helping an elderly visitor find a misplaced reading glass. She remembered delivering coffee to the upstairs library. She remembered locking her employee locker before beginning the afternoon banquet preparations. Nothing else. No missing minutes. No mysterious visitor. No reason the jewelry box should have been there. She slowly looked toward the other members of the household staff, hoping someone might remember seeing another person near the lockers. Most lowered their eyes. A few looked genuinely heartbroken, but fear held them in place. They depended on these jobs to support their own families. Speaking up without proof could cost them everything. Naomi understood that, which somehow made the silence hurt even more. Standing only a few feet away, one elegantly dressed guest smiled with quiet satisfaction before quickly hiding the expression behind polite concern. It lasted barely a second, too brief for anyone focused on Naomi to notice. Anyone except the elderly groundskeeper trimming hedges beside the east walkway. He paused only long enough to recognize the smile before returning to his work without saying a word. He had spent more than 30 years maintaining the estate, and experience had taught him something simple. Truly innocent people often looked frightened. Truly dishonest people usually looked relieved. Somewhere beyond the tall iron gates, the deep rumble of an approaching engine grew louder, echoing across the stone driveway. With calm confidence, the orchestra continued playing inside the ballroom. The guests continued whispering among themselves, and Naomi continued standing alone. None of them realized that the next arrival would not simply change the outcome of the afternoon. It would expose who everyone had chosen to become long before the missing watch ever entered the conversation. The sound of the approaching engine finally reached the courtyard, not as a dramatic interruption, but as a quiet reminder that true authority rarely needed to announce itself. One by one, conversations faded into uneasy silence as every head turned toward the wrought iron gates. A long black motorcade rolled through the entrance with measured precision, each vehicle gliding across the circular driveway, as though every inch of polished stone already belonged to it. The estate manager straightened his jacket. Several influential guests instinctively stepped aside. Even those who had been speaking the loudest only moments earlier lowered their voices without realizing it. Naomi remained exactly where she was, her hands folded calmly in front of her, uncertain why the atmosphere had changed so suddenly. The vehicles came to a smooth stop beneath the towering columns of the mansion. For several long seconds, no one moved. The orchestra inside the ballroom continued playing, yet somehow every note sounded distant now. Then the rear door of the lead sedan opened. A polished black dress shoe touched the stone first, followed by the tall figure of Vincent Moretti. His tailored black suit looked almost weightless against the afternoon light. The open collar of his black dress shirt revealed only a glimpse of the intricate black and gray tattoos climbing above his chest, while similar artwork framed his neck and disappeared beneath the crisp fabric. His dark brown hair, streaked naturally with touches of gray, remained perfectly swept back despite the breeze moving through the courtyard. His expression revealed nothing. Not anger, not curiosity, only complete control. Behind him, several members of his security team remained respectfully several steps away, allowing him to walk forward alone. Vincent did not hurry. Every measured step across the marble carried the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions that others accepted without debate. His calm brown eyes traveled across the gathered crowd before settling briefly on Naomi. He noticed the trembling hidden beneath her composed posture. He noticed the untouched tears collecting in her eyes without falling. Most importantly, he noticed that although everyone claimed certainty, nobody appeared comfortable standing behind that certainty anymore. The estate manager immediately stepped forward wearing a practiced smile. He began explaining the unfortunate situation before Vincent had asked a single question, carefully describing the missing diamond watch, the discovery of the jewelry box, and the overwhelming evidence against the employee standing alone. The explanation sounded polished, rehearsed, almost too perfect. Vincent listened without interrupting. He neither nodded nor frowned. He simply observed the faces surrounding him instead of the words reaching his ears. One guest appeared strangely eager for approval. Another refused to meet his eyes altogether. The elderly groundskeeper quietly remained beside the trimmed hedges, watching with patient concern. Naomi lowered her head respectfully as Vincent stopped several feet in front of her. She expected another accusation because disappointment had become familiar during the past hour. Instead, the courtyard was filled with something far more unsettling than shouting. Silence. Vincent allowed it to linger until every whisper had completely disappeared. Only then did he slowly lift his eyes toward the assembled guests and ask a single calm question that seemed almost impossibly simple. Who decided she was guilty before asking her what happened? No one answered. For the first time since the accusation began, certainty itself seemed to lose its voice. No one rushed to answer because everyone suddenly understood that the question was not searching for information. It was measuring character. The afternoon breeze drifted across the courtyard, carrying the faint scent of white roses while crystal glasses inside the ballroom continued to sparkle. Beneath golden light, untouched and forgotten, Vincent Moretti remained perfectly still, his calm expression revealing nothing, yet the silence surrounding him felt heavier than any accusation spoken earlier. The estate manager finally cleared his throat and forced a polite smile onto his face. He explained that the decision had been based on overwhelming evidence and the responsibility to protect the reputation of the estate. His words sounded carefully selected, each sentence polished enough to impress a boardroom. Vincent listened without interrupting. When the explanation ended, he slowly turned toward Naomi for the first time. His voice remained even, almost gentle. "Miss Brooks, I have heard everyone else speak. I have not heard you." Naomi looked up in surprise. For nearly an hour, dozens of people had discussed her life without once asking for her side of the story. She drew a slow breath, trying to steady the nervous tremble in her chest. "Sir, I did not take the watch," she said quietly. "I have never entered the private jewelry room. I locked my employee locker before breakfast, and I did not open it again until someone told me the jewelry box had been found inside." There was no dramatic speech, no desperate pleading, only simple facts spoken with quiet honesty. Vincent held her gaze for several seconds as though weighing not only her words but the person standing before him. Then he asked another unexpected question. "How long have you worked here?" 3 years and 11 months. Naomi answered without hesitation. "Have you ever received a complaint for dishonesty?" She shook her head. Before anyone else could respond, an elderly woman among the guests slowly raised her hand. She explained that Naomi had once returned an envelope containing several $1,000s after it had accidentally been left in a guest suite. Another gentleman admitted that Naomi had found his expensive wedding band near the swimming pool months earlier and refused the reward he offered. One by one, quiet memories began surfacing from people who had remained silent while accusations spread. A housekeeper remembered Naomi covering an extra shift so another employee could attend her daughter's graduation. A chef recalled Naomi paying for groceries when a dishwasher could not afford food before payday. None of those stories proved where the missing watch had gone, but together they painted a picture very different from the one the crowd had accepted only minutes earlier. Vincent noticed something else. Each act of kindness had been mentioned only after he invited people to think instead of react. He slowly looked back toward the velvet jewelry box resting on the silver tray. It had become the centerpiece of the accusation, yet nobody had explained how such an important discovery had happened so conveniently during the busiest hour of the afternoon. His brown eyes shifted across the faces surrounding him until they rested for a brief moment on one elegantly dressed guest whose confidence seemed to fade just enough to be noticed. It lasted only a heartbeat. Then the expression disappeared. But Vincent had already seen it, and somewhere deep inside the carefully constructed story unfolding before the mansion, the first invisible crack had finally appeared. Vincent slowly stepped toward the silver tray until the velvet jewelry box rested only a few inches from his hand. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he studied everything around it. The polished tray was spotless except for a faint fingerprint near one corner. The estate manager stood with his hands folded behind his back, trying to appear calm, while several guests exchanged uncertain glances that grew more uncomfortable with every passing second. Naomi remained exactly where she had been asked to stand, saying nothing more because she understood that truth did not become stronger through repetition. Vincent finally lifted the jewelry box with deliberate care. It felt surprisingly light. He opened it just enough to confirm it was empty before closing it again with a quiet click that echoed across the silent courtyard. Then he looked toward the estate manager. "Who found this?" The answer came quickly. "I did, sir." "Were you alone?" A brief pause. "No. 2 supervisors were present." Vincent nodded once. "Did either of them search the locker before you arrived?" The manager hesitated for the first time that afternoon. "I cannot say with certainty." Vincent turned toward the supervisors standing several feet away. Their expressions immediately shifted from confidence to uncertainty. One admitted he had stepped away to answer a telephone call before the locker was opened. The other quietly acknowledged that he had arrived after the jewelry box had already been discovered. The courtyard grew even quieter. The story that had sounded so complete only minutes earlier no longer fit together as neatly as before. Vincent asked no dramatic questions. He simply continued placing one fact beside another until the spaces between them became impossible to ignore. "Who has access to employee lockers?" he asked. The head of security answered that department supervisors, maintenance personnel, and estate management all possessed master access cards for emergency situations. Vincent slowly looked back toward Naomi. "Do you?" She gently shook her head. "Only my own key, sir." Another invisible piece settled into place. The elderly groundskeeper who had remained silent throughout the afternoon finally removed his gardening gloves and stepped forward with respectful hesitation. He apologized for speaking out of turn, but explained that while trimming hedges near the service entrance earlier that day, he had noticed one elegantly dressed guest leaving the employee corridor, an area reserved exclusively for staff. At the time, he assumed the visitor had become lost. Now he was no longer certain. Every eye in the courtyard shifted toward the guests. Faces that had once displayed absolute certainty now searched one another for reassurance. Vincent noticed the same well-dressed gentleman whose fleeting smile had caught his attention earlier. Although the man remained outwardly composed, he had quietly loosened his necktie and checked his wristwatch 3 separate times within only a few minutes. Small details, ordinary details. Yet Vincent had built an entire life by recognizing ordinary details that other people overlooked. He placed the jewelry box back onto the silver tray exactly where it had been before. Then he folded his hands behind his back and calmly surveyed the gathering once more. "Interesting," he said softly. "The evidence against Miss Brooks has become weaker every time someone has spoken, while the questions surrounding everyone else have become stronger." No one argued. No one dared interrupt. The afternoon sun dipped lower across the marble courtyard, casting long shadows between the guests as certainty quietly gave way to doubt. And for the first time since the accusation began, Naomi was no longer the only person standing under suspicion. Vincent allowed the silence to settle before speaking again because silence had a way of inviting truth to reveal itself. He slowly walked toward the mansion entrance, his polished shoes crossing the marble with measured confidence, then stopped beside the estate security console positioned just inside the foyer. The large display monitored every major hallway, every entrance, every service corridor. He did not demand immediate answers. He simply asked a quiet question. "How many security cameras are installed on this property?" The head of security answered without hesitation. 72, sir." Vincent nodded. "Then help me understand why everyone believes we know exactly what happened when nobody has shown a single recording." The question spread through the room like a ripple across still water. The estate manager quickly explained that the camera covering the employee lockers had stopped recording because of a temporary system interruption. Vincent listened patiently. "How long?" "Approximately 20 minutes. "Interesting," Vincent replied. The locker was searched during those same 20 minutes. Nobody spoke. He turned toward the security supervisor. "Does this system create backup files?" The supervisor swallowed before answering. "Yes, sir. The primary server occasionally fails, but a secondary archive stores lower resolution footage." Several guests exchanged uneasy glances. Until that moment, many had assumed the missing recordings simply no longer existed. Vincent calmly requested the backup without raising his voice. The supervisor hurried to the control station, his fingers moving carefully across the keyboard while everyone watched the monitor in complete silence. Naomi stood motionless, refusing to let hope replace caution too soon. She had already learned how quickly appearances could deceive. The loading screen seemed to last forever before grainy footage finally appeared. The image was not perfectly clear, yet it captured enough. The employee hallway remained almost empty throughout the morning. Housekeepers passed through carrying clean linens. Maintenance workers transported equipment carts. Then, only minutes before the jewelry box was supposedly discovered, a sharply dressed guest entered the restricted corridor after briefly looking over his shoulder. The recording showed him using a staff access card handed to him by someone standing just outside the camera frame. He disappeared toward the locker area. Nearly 5 minutes later, he returned without the calm confidence he had displayed before entering. His pace had become noticeably quicker. The courtyard fell completely silent. Nobody needed perfect video quality to recognize the face. It belonged to the same distinguished guest whose confidence had slowly faded ever since Vincent began asking questions. The gentleman attempted a polite smile before explaining that he had simply become lost while searching for a restroom. Vincent remained expressionless. That explanation would be easier to accept, he said calmly. If the public restrooms were not located in the opposite direction and clearly marked every 30 feet. Several guests instinctively looked toward the hallway signs they had passed earlier that afternoon. The explanation collapsed under its own weight. Vincent then asked one final question. Who gave him the staff access card? Once again, the recording provided part of the answer. Although the person's face remained outside the camera view, the sleeve of a tailored jacket and the distinctive silver cuff links were visible for only a moment. The estate manager unconsciously lowered his wrists beneath the sleeves of his own jacket. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but Vincent noticed it immediately. So did Naomi. For the first time since the accusation began, the truth was no longer hiding behind rumors. It was quietly assembling itself one careful piece at a time, and every person standing in the courtyard understood that the next answer would change far more than the fate of one innocent employee. No one challenged the recording because no one could. The grainy backup footage had not answered every question, but it had shattered the illusion that Naomi had been caught through an honest investigation. Vincent remained composed, his brown eyes moving from the security monitor to the distinguished guest whose confidence had disappeared entirely. The gentleman adjusted his jacket once more before forcing a courteous smile that convinced no one. He insisted there had been a misunderstanding, explaining that he had wandered into the employee hallway while looking for a quiet place to answer a telephone call. His voice sounded polished, but it lacked the certainty it carried only half an hour earlier. Vincent slowly folded his hands behind his back. You have changed your explanation 3 times, he said calmly. Truth rarely needs revisions. The courtyard fell silent again. Then an unexpected voice broke through the tension. It belonged to Melissa Carter, one of the junior housekeepers who had remained near the ballroom entrance throughout the afternoon. She hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward. Her hands trembled, yet her eyes remained fixed on Vincent. She admitted she had stayed silent because she feared losing her job, but after watching everything unfold, she could no longer pretend she had seen nothing. Earlier that morning, she had noticed the estate manager speaking privately with the same guest beside the service corridor. She had also watched the manager remove a master access card from his jacket before handing it over for only a few minutes. At the time, she assumed they were discussing preparations for the event. Now the memory felt completely different. The estate manager immediately denied the accusation, calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding created by stress and confusion. Before anyone could respond, the elderly groundskeeper quietly reached into the pocket of his work apron and unfolded a small maintenance logbook. Every employee responsible for the property recorded unusual activity throughout the day. He calmly pointed to an entry made just before noon. It noted that the employee corridor had briefly been blocked because an unexpected visitor had entered an area reserved for staff. The groundskeeper had written the note simply to explain a delay in landscaping deliveries. He had no idea it would later become important. Vincent accepted the worn notebook and studied the handwriting for several seconds before handing it back with a respectful nod. Independent observations. Different witnesses. Separate moments. Yet every piece pointed in the same direction. The distinguished guest slowly lowered his eyes. Without waiting to be questioned again, he admitted that he had entered the hallway at the manager's request. However, He insisted he believed he was participating in nothing more than a harmless loyalty test for the household staff. The explanation spread visible discomfort across the gathered guests. Several looked toward the estate manager with disbelief. Others quietly stepped away from him without saying a word. Vincent finally turned toward the manager, whose carefully maintained composure had begun to unravel. A test, Vincent repeated softly. Interesting. Because a test measures integrity. What happened here measured prejudice. No one disagreed. Naomi stood motionless, struggling to understand how quickly the story had changed. Only an hour earlier, she had been surrounded by strangers convinced of her guilt. Now the same people were beginning to recognize that the greatest deception had never been hidden inside her locker. It had been hidden inside the assumptions they had accepted without question. The afternoon sun settled lower behind the estate, washing the marble courtyard in soft golden light that seemed almost determined to erase the harshness of what had happened only moments before. Nobody celebrated the discovery. Nobody applauded. The silence carried something far more powerful than victory. It carried reflection. Vincent slowly walked toward Naomi until they stood only a few feet apart. She instinctively lowered her eyes, still uncertain whether the nightmare had truly ended. For nearly an hour, she had been treated as though her character could be measured by a single accusation. Even with the truth unfolding around her, she found it difficult to believe that everything had changed. Vincent spoke with the same calm voice he had used from the moment he arrived. "Miss Brooks," he said, "look at me." She slowly raised her eyes. There was no anger in his expression, only quiet respect. "You deserve to be heard before you were judged." Those simple words reached far deeper than any formal apology could have. Naomi felt the weight pressing against her chest begin to lift, not because someone important had defended her, but because someone had finally acknowledged what should have happened from the very beginning. Vincent then turned toward the assembled guests, the household staff, and every executive standing beneath the grand entrance of the estate. "Today," he said, "everyone witnessed how easily intelligence can surrender to assumption. Evidence was ignored. Character was forgotten. Reputation was destroyed before a single honest conversation took place." His words were never louder than necessary, yet every person listened without moving. The estate manager quietly removed the identification badge from his jacket and placed it on the nearby table without being asked. The distinguished guest who had agreed to participate in the so-called loyalty test lowered his head and admitted that he had a loud ambition to overpower judgment. Vincent acknowledged the admission with a brief nod before calmly instructing members of his team to escort both men away from the gathering so the remaining facts could be reviewed through proper legal and organizational procedures. There was no public humiliation, no shouting, no celebration. Accountability did not require spectacle. It required fairness. As they departed, many of the guests looked away, recognizing that silence had made them participants long before evidence had revealed the truth. Vincent then faced the household employees. "Every person who works inside this estate deserves the same dignity as every person invited through its front gate," he said. "Uniforms describe responsibilities. They do not determine human worth." Several staff members quietly wiped away tears they had struggled to hide throughout the afternoon. Melissa Carter gently stepped beside Naomi and whispered that she was sorry for remaining silent when her voice might have mattered sooner. Naomi answered with a grateful smile and softly thanked her for speaking when it became most difficult. Sometimes courage arrived late, but it still arrived. The orchestra inside the ballroom resumed playing, though the music felt different now. Conversations returned in quiet voices, stripped of the arrogance that had filled the courtyard earlier. Even the white roses lining the stone walkway seemed somehow more peaceful beneath the evening light. Vincent looked across the gathering one final time before calmly saying, "Justice is not measured by how quickly we punish. It is measured by how carefully we seek the truth." No one offered a reply because none was needed. Every face in the courtyard revealed the same realization. The greatest mistake that afternoon had never been the missing watch. It had been forgetting that dignity belongs to every person long before innocence is ever questioned. Several weeks passed, yet the events of that afternoon continued to echo far beyond the walls of the estate. The missing watch was eventually recovered through the formal investigation, confirming everything Vincent had quietly uncovered before anyone else believed it. The findings cleared Naomi Brooks completely, but more importantly, they forced every person connected to the estate to confront something far more valuable than a piece of jewelry. They confronted the cost of judging a human being before seeking the truth. Changes followed, not because of public pressure, but because Vincent insisted that trust could only return through action. Every employee, regardless of position, received the same procedural protections whenever concerns were raised. No accusation would ever again become a verdict before evidence had been carefully examined. Staff members attended new training sessions centered on fairness, accountability, and professional respect. Managers learned that leadership was measured not by authority, but by the willingness to protect the dignity of every person under their responsibility. Guests who returned to the estate noticed subtle differences. Conversations with employees became warmer. Housekeepers were greeted by name instead of being overlooked. Servers received sincere thanks instead of silent expectations. Small moments of respect slowly reshaped the atmosphere more effectively than any expensive renovation ever could. Naomi continued her work, although many expected her to leave after everything she had endured. Friends gently encouraged her to seek another position where painful memories would not follow her through every hallway. She considered it carefully, but in the end she chose to remain. She explained that running away would allow one terrible afternoon to define years of honest work. Instead, she wanted every new day to become proof that integrity survives even when trust is temporarily broken. Her quiet resilience inspired people more deeply than dramatic speeches ever could. Melissa Carter often joined Naomi during lunch breaks beneath the old oak tree near the service garden, where the two women laughed more easily than before. Their friendship had grown from fear, transformed into courage. Even the elderly groundskeeper smiled whenever he passed them, grateful that writing one ordinary note inside a worn maintenance logbook had helped protect an innocent life. One autumn evening, Vincent returned to the estate for another gathering. The atmosphere felt entirely different. Employees moved confidently through the halls. Guests treated them with visible appreciation, and genuine respect had replaced the invisible distance that once divided people by titles alone. As Vincent prepared to leave, he noticed Naomi helping an elderly visitor whose cane had slipped across the polished floor. She offered assistance with the same kindness she had shown long before anyone defended her. She had not become compassionate because justice finally arrived. She had always been that person. The difference was that others could finally see it. Vincent watched quietly for a moment before giving a small nod that required no words. Character had revealed itself exactly where accusations once tried to bury it. The evening breeze carried the scent of blooming roses across the courtyard as the mansion lights reflected against the marble steps, peaceful and undisturbed. Some stories ended with applause. Others ended with silence because silence was the only response worthy of the truth. Long after the guests had departed and the lights inside the ballroom had grown dim, one lesson remained stronger than every rumor that had once filled the estate. A person's uniform could never measure their value. Power could never replace fairness. And on that unforgettable day, everyone who stood inside those gates remembered what true dignity looked like.